Baby girl saw a German shepherd stuck under a broken wagon. The ending left the whole town in tears. A little girl. A silent scream. A moment that shattered the silence of an entire town. What she did next left doctors stunned and strangers in tears. This is more than a rescue. It's a lesson in bravery, love, and what it truly means to be human. Like, share, and subscribe. This story will stay with you long after it ends. The rain came heavy that evening, as if the sky itself had opened its heart and poured every sorrow down upon the little town. Water streamed off rooftops, ran in rivers along the dirt road, and hammered against the tin porch of the Harper farmhouse. Inside, most families pulled their curtains tight and stayed warm near their stoves. But on the wooden porch of that old house, a small figure sat quietly, untouched by the rush of the world around her. 3-year-old Clara, in her faded blue dress and tiny yellow boots, sat cross-legged, clutching a wooden toy horse in her hands. She didn't giggle the way other children her age might. She didn't run or sing. Ever since her mother's passing, silence had become her language. Only her grandfather knew how to read her now. The small tilt of her head, the way her little fingers fidgeted when she was nervous, the way her eyes scanned the horizon as if searching for something just beyond sight. The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a wagon wheel groaned, a strange sound, almost like metal grinding against wood. Clara paused, her toy slipping from her hand. At first, she thought it was the storm playing tricks. But then she heard it. Not thunder, not rain. A sound softer, more fragile. A whimper. Her small brow furrowed, and she turned her head toward the old barnyard. It had been years since anyone used that place. The wooden beams sagged under their own weight, and an abandoned wagon leaned against the fence, half broken and forgotten. Nobody ever went there anymore. Nobody except Clara, who now stood without a word, her eyes fixed, her body pulled forward by something she didn't fully understand. "Clara," her grandfather called from inside the house, his voice muffled by the storm. She didn't answer. She stepped off the porch, her boots splashing in muddy puddles, rain soaking her hair until it clung in dark curls against her cheeks. The sound grew clearer now, weaving through the wind, a desperate cry, weak but persistent. She hurried across the yard, her little feet sinking into the wet grass. The barn loomed tall and broken, its doors barely hanging on. And there, beside the collapsed wagon, she saw him. A German shepherd, his once proud frame now pinned beneath the heavy timber of the broken wheel. His sides rose and fell in shallow gasps, his fur matted with mud and rain. One paw stretched outward from beneath the wreckage, trembling as if begging the world not to look away. Clara stopped, her breath catching in her tiny chest. The sight of him, helpless, forgotten, drowning in rain, was too much for a child's heart to bear. Slowly, carefully, she knelt beside him. Her small fingers, cold from the storm, reached out and touched his paw. The dog whimpered softly, his eyes flickering open. And in that fleeting moment, something passed between them. No words, no language, just the silent recognition of pain meeting pain, loss meeting loss. Clara's eyes filled with tears, warm against the cold rain that streaked her cheeks. She didn't know why the world had led her here, only that she couldn't walk away. The thunder cracked overhead, and the wind howled through the broken barn. But amidst the storm, one truth became clear. A little girl's innocent touch had found a broken soul. And neither of them would ever be the same again. The barn at the edge of town had once been the pride of Pinehill. Long ago, horses had whinnied in its stalls, children had laughed as they played hide-and-seek in the hayloft, and the creak of wagon wheels had echoed against its sturdy wooden walls. But time had a way of taking even the strongest things. The roof sagged now, the doors leaned crookedly on their hinges, and wild vines had wrapped themselves like chains around its frame. People passed it every day without so much as a glance. To them, it was no longer a place of life, only a memory waiting to collapse into dust. But to little Clara, it was more than broken wood and forgotten history. That stormy evening, it became the place where a life called out for help, and where her own heart began to awaken. Her tiny fingers gripped the paw of the German shepherd trapped beneath the fallen wagon, refusing to let go. The dog's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving against the crushing weight. His eyes, dulled by pain, blinked weakly at the child kneeling beside him. The storm raged, thunder roaring, but Clara did not move. She stayed, her soaked blue dress clinging to her small frame, her wide eyes fixed on the creature whose life hung by a thread. Behind her, heavy footsteps splashed through the mud. "Clara!" Her grandfather's voice cut through the rain. Jack Harper, tall and weathered with 68 years of work etched into his bones, came running across the yard. His old flannel shirt was soaked, and his boots sank deep into the soft earth as he hurried toward his granddaughter. "What in heaven's name?" His words stopped when he saw what she had found. The sight froze him. The wagon, he remembered it well, had collapsed years ago, left there to rot. Yet somehow, impossibly, beneath its cracked wheel and broken boards, a living animal remained. The shepherd's ribs stuck out, his fur clumped with mud and straw. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Dear Lord," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside Clara. Clara looked up at him with pleading eyes, her small hand still clutching the dog's paw. For months, she had barely looked at anyone like that, not since her mother's passing. Jack felt something stir deep inside him, a mixture of pain, hope, and fear. He reached forward, brushing away wet strands of fur from the shepherd's face. The dog flinched, then whimpered, but his gaze never left Clara. Jack placed a hand on the wagon, testing the weight. The wood groaned dangerously. "How long have you been here, boy?" he murmured, his voice breaking. "How did no one know?" Clara tugged on his sleeve with her tiny hand, urging him. She didn't speak, but her meaning was clear. "Save him." Jack exhaled slowly, torn between his fear for Clara's safety and the desperation in her eyes. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help. "Stay here with him," Jack said softly, brushing Clara's cheek. "Don't move, sweet pea. I'll get the others." He stood and hurried back across the yard, his voice rising above the storm. Soon, lanterns flickered to life across the little town as neighbors, curious about the old man's shouts, began to gather. Men in raincoats, women clutching shawls, children clinging to their mothers' skirts all followed him back to the barn. When they arrived, gasps rippled through the crowd. The shepherd lay motionless, his breathing shallow, the child's tiny hand wrapped around his muddy paw. "That dog's half dead," muttered one man, shaking his head. "No use straining over it." "Better to put him out of his misery," another said grimly. Jack turned sharply. "You hush now." Not in front of the child. His voice, though cracked with age, carried authority. He had once been the town's veterinarian, and his words still carried weight. But it wasn't Jack's anger that silenced the whispers. It was Clara. She sat in the mud, rain streaming down her cheeks, her small body trembling but unmoving. She would not let go of the dog. Her eyes, wide, innocent, unblinking, spoke louder than any words. The villagers exchanged glances. Some looked away, guilt prickling at them. Others shifted uncomfortably, their arguments dissolving in the face of a child's silent plea. Even the hardest hearts felt it, that fragile thread between the broken shepherd and the little girl, binding them in a bond no storm could sever. Jack knelt again beside her. "We'll try, Clara," he said quietly. "We'll try." He pressed his palm against the wagon's beam, feeling the weight, the way it pinned the dog's ribs. His mind raced. If they didn't act soon, the shepherd wouldn't make it. But if they acted recklessly, the wood could crush him completely. "Get me ropes," Jack ordered. "Crowbars, whatever you can find. We'll lift it together." Lanterns bobbed as men ran for tools. Women hurried to fetch blankets, old towels, and buckets of water. For the first time in years, the abandoned barnyard buzzed with life again. And at the center of it all sat Clara, refusing to move, her hand never leaving the shepherd's paw. The dog let out a low whine, his eyes fluttering open once more. Clara leaned close, her forehead nearly touching his. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, a tear slipped free, rolling down her cheek and landing on the shepherd's fur. And in that moment, the old barnyard became something more than broken wood and rusted wheels. It became a place where a town paused, where silence spoke louder than shouts, and where a child's innocent tears demanded the impossible, that a forgotten life be given a second chance. The drizzle had settled into a steady rhythm, tapping gently against lantern glass as the people of Pinehill crowded around the broken wagon. The night air smelled of wet soil and hay, and the glow of kerosene lamps cast long shadows across the barnyard. At the center of it all lay the German shepherd, his body shivering under the weight of the collapsed beam, his breaths shallow and uneven. Beside him, little Clara sat in the mud, her blue dress soaked through, her small hand clutching the dog's paw as though it was the most important thing in her world. The whispers began almost immediately. Earl Jennings, the blacksmith with arms thick as oak branches, shook his head grimly. "That dog's done for," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Best to put him down quick and save the girl the pain of watching him fade." His words cut through the gathering like a cold wind, and several men nodded reluctantly. To farmers hardened by years of life and death on the land, mercy often meant letting go. But not everyone agreed. Mrs. Bell, the baker's wife, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders as tears welled in her eyes. "Look at her," she whispered, pointing toward Clara. "That child hasn't spoken since her mother passed. She's been lost in her own silence for months, and now she's holding on to him as if he's her own heartbeat. Don't you see? If we give up on the dog, we give up on her too." Jack Harper, standing tall despite the weight of 68 weary years, tightened his grip on the crowbar in his hands. His flannel shirt clung to his back, soaked through, but his eyes blazed with something fierce. "I've seen suffering," he said, his voice strong enough to hush the murmurs. "I've watched men fall in war and animals broken on farms. And I'll tell you this, there's still life in him. Look close and you'll see it too. That dog hasn't given up, and neither should we." The villagers turned their lanterns toward the shepherd, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest, the dull but steady flicker in his eyes. Clara leaned closer, her curls plastered against her face by rain, her small lips moving silently as if she were speaking only to him. The dog's tail thumped weakly once against the mud, and a murmur ran through the crowd. Earl scowled, unwilling to bend so easily. "And when the wagon shifts and crushes a man trying to free him, will you take the blame then, Harper?" Jack's jaw tightened, his lined face lit with determination. "I'll take every bit of blame. You know me, Earl. I've never turned my back on this town, and I'm not starting now. If something happens, it'll be on me. But I'll not stand here and watch an innocent creature die while a child begs us to save him." His voice cracked slightly, but the fire in it only grew stronger. The drizzle softened to a mist, and in the heavy silence that followed, Clara lifted her eyes from the shepherd and looked straight into the faces of the villagers. Wide, tear-filled, unblinking. She said nothing, but the message was louder than thunder. "Please don't leave him." That gaze struck harder than any argument. Men who prided themselves on their iron will shifted uncomfortably. Women clutched their children tighter. Even Earl found himself glancing away, ashamed to meet the child's eyes. Mrs. Bell wiped at her cheeks. You see? Even in her silence, she's speaking to us all. If that little girl can find hope here, maybe we should too. The debate that had divided the barnyard began to crumble. Rough hands softened. Stern faces melted. Slowly, one by one, people nodded. Finally, Earl let out a long, frustrated sigh. Fine. But mark my words, this could go bad. And when it does, don't come crying to me. Jack gave a single nod, relief loosening his shoulders. Then let's do it together. No rushing, no foolishness. Ropes, crowbars, and steady hands. We'll lift inch by inch until there's space enough to slide him free. At once, the quiet barnyard stirred with purpose. Men ran for ropes and sturdy boards. Young boys fetched buckets of water and old tools from the shadows of the barn. Women gathered blankets, laying them across the mud where the dog could be placed once he was freed. Even the children pitched in, carrying what little they could with wide-eyed determination. The abandoned place, forgotten for years, seemed to come alive again, pulsing with urgency and compassion. Jack knelt beside Clara, brushing damp curls from her face. "Sweet pea," he murmured, "we're going to try. But when we start, you'll need to step back. It's not safe." But Clara shook her head fiercely, her hand tightening around the shepherd's paw. Her silence spoke louder than any cry. She wouldn't leave him. Not now. Jack hesitated, torn between his duty as a grandfather and the unmistakable bond he saw forming before his eyes. At last, he exhaled heavily and whispered, "Then stay close to me. But promise you won't let go of my hand." Clara blinked once, solemnly, as if sealing the promise. The first rope was tied around the beam. Boots dug into the soft ground as men took their places. Crowbars wedged under the warped axle. The wood creaked ominously, threatening to splinter under their touch. Jack raised his voice, steady and commanding, the way he once had in the war. "Easy now. On my mark. Steady hands, steady hearts." Clara leaned down, pressing her forehead lightly against the shepherd's paw, whispering something only he could hear. For the first time, the dog's ears twitched, and his dull eyes brightened just enough to meet hers. The lantern light flickered across them both, and in that fragile exchange of trust, the whole town saw what Jack already knew. The life of the dog and the hope of the child were bound together. Saving one meant saving the other. The people of Pinehill, once divided by doubt and fear, now stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the misty rain. For the sake of one broken creature, for the plea of one silent child, they chose compassion. And with ropes pulled taut and crowbars braced, they began the impossible task, lifting not just the weight of a wagon, but the burden of their own hardened hearts. The ropes tightened with a groan, their fibers stretching as half a dozen men pulled in unison. Crowbars wedged deeper under the axle, mud sucking at boots as the storm began to pick up again. The drizzle turned once more into sharp drops, splattering against lantern glass and rattling across the tin roof of the barn. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the scene for a heartbeat at a time. Sweat dripping from brows, trembling hands gripping wooden beams, the shepherd's frail body pinned beneath the wagon's crushing weight. "Steady now," Jack Harper barked, his voice rising above the storm. He pressed his old boots into the mud and braced his crowbar with all the strength his aging arms could muster. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he refused to let go. His granddaughter's wide eyes were fixed on him, on the shepherd, on the miracle she believed was possible. He wouldn't let her down. Not tonight. The wagon groaned like a wounded giant. Wood splintered under pressure, threatening to collapse entirely. Men cursed under their breath, straining, their faces twisted with effort. The lanterns swayed wildly in the wind, shadows flickering across the barnyard like restless spirits. And then, in the chaos, Clara moved. Without warning, the 3-year-old slipped from Jack's side, crawling forward on her hands and knees. Mud smeared her tiny palms, her soaked blue dress dragged in the dirt, but she pressed forward until she was beneath the tilted edge of the wagon. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Clara!" Jack shouted, panic seizing his chest. "Get back here!" But she didn't listen. The little girl crawled right up to the shepherd's muzzle, her tiny hands trembling as she reached for him. The dog's labored breathing filled the air, shallow and broken, yet when Clara pressed her palm against his paw, he stirred. His dull eyes blinked once, then again, and slowly they lifted to meet hers. In that moment, time seemed to still. Thunder rolled far above, but its echo faded. The crowd's grunts and shouts blurred into silence. There was only a little girl kneeling in the mud and a broken dog who should have been too weak to respond, but wasn't. With a slow, deliberate motion, the shepherd stretched his muzzle forward and licked her tiny hand. A single gesture, faint but undeniable. Tears welled in Jack's eyes. It wasn't just instinct. It wasn't just survival. It was trust. A wounded, half-conscious animal putting his last ounce of faith into the hands of a child. The villagers who had once argued, who had doubted and resisted, stood frozen. That one lick dissolved every wall of practicality, every thought of giving up. Even Earl Jennings lowered his head, shame coloring his features as he muttered, "By God, if he still believes, then so should we." Jack's voice shook, but it carried with the force of command. "Pull! Everyone together! Now!" The ropes strained, snapping taut. Crowbars groaned as steel bit deeper into wood. Men dug their heels into the mud, backs arching as they heaved with everything they had left. The wagon shifted, just an inch at first, then another. Splinters rained down as the beam lifted slowly, groaning in protest. "Higher!" Jack cried. His arms shook violently, sweat mingling with rain. Just a little more. For hours it felt as though time had stretched, each second an eternity of straining muscles and gritted teeth. The storm showed no mercy, winds whipping cloaks and skirts, lightning flashing across the fields. But they did not stop. Clara's tiny hand remained pressed to the shepherd's paw, her silent presence the anchor that held them all steady. At last, with one final heave, the wagon lifted enough for Jack to thrust his crowbar into place and wedge it open. "Now!" he roared, falling to his knees beside the shepherd. With the help of 2 younger men, he slid his arms under the weakened animal and pulled him free. The dog's body was limp, half-conscious, his ribs rising and falling in shallow rhythm. His fur clung to his frame, drenched in mud and blood. But he was out. He was alive. Jack laid him gently on the blankets the women had spread in the mud. For a moment, the barnyard was utterly silent, every eye fixed on the dog. And then Clara's voice broke it, soft, high, and miraculous. A giggle. Not the hollow sound of a child pretending to be happy, but a true giggle, bright and bubbling, spilling from her chest as she clapped her tiny hands together. Her cheeks, streaked with rain and tears, lit up with the faintest smile. It was the first sound of joy she had made in weeks, and Jack's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and awe. His Clara, who had lived in silence since tragedy took her mother, was beginning to heal, and it had taken a dying dog to remind her how. Jack swallowed hard, blinking back tears as he brushed a hand across her wet hair. "That's it, sweet pea. That's it." The dog stirred weakly at the sound of Clara's laughter, his ears twitching despite his exhaustion. His head lifted just slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. He had survived the impossible, and in doing so, he had pulled a child back from the depths of her grief. "Quick, to the barn," Jack ordered, regaining his composure. "We need to get him dry and warm. He won't last long out here." Neighbors rushed forward, lifting the shepherd carefully onto a makeshift stretcher of planks and blankets. Women hurried ahead to clear space in the barn, their lanterns casting warm light into the darkness. Children scampered to fetch towels and old quilts. Even Earl Jennings, who had been the loudest against saving him, bent down to grab one end of the stretcher without hesitation. As they carried the dog toward shelter, something had changed in the air. What began as a divided town, split between mercy and pragmatism, was now a single force bound by compassion. The shepherd was no longer just an animal in peril. He was theirs. Clara's silent tears and sudden laughter had carved a place for him in every heart present. Inside the barn, Jack barked orders like the veterinarian he once was, directing townsfolk to fetch water, light fires, and bring his old medical kit. Lanterns glowed warmly against the wooden beams, pushing back the storm outside. The German shepherd lay in the center, his breath still ragged but steadier than before, while Clara knelt at his side, whispering softly to him as though she had always known how. And for the first time in years, the abandoned barnyard was no longer a place of decay and silence. It was a sanctuary, alive with people, with purpose, and with the fragile but undeniable hope that one broken creature's survival could heal more than just himself. The barn smelled of damp wood and hay, of smoke from the small fire the villagers had lit to dry clothes and warm chilled bones. The German shepherd lay stretched upon a bed of old quilts, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, his fur still matted with mud and blood. Lantern light flickered against his ribs, making every hollow more visible, every scar more haunting. Jack Harper knelt beside him, his hands steady even as his heart twisted. The years of practice as a veterinarian came rushing back. The careful way to check a pulse beneath fur, the trained eye-catching details others missed. He ran a gentle hand down the shepherd's side, fingers pausing at ridges carved unnaturally into his skin. "These aren't from the wagon," Jack murmured. These are older." His voice dropped lower, roughened by grief and disbelief. "Somebody hurt him. More than once." The words drew uneasy glances around the barn. A hush fell as villagers leaned closer, their faces pale in the firelight. Old scars, thin lines crisscrossing his legs. A deeper mark, almost like rope burn, circled the neck where a collar must have rubbed too tight for too long. Across his flank, a jagged scar curved like a cruel memory. Mrs. Bell pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh, that poor soul." Before anyone could speak further, a voice rasped from the shadows. It was Amos Turner, the oldest man in town, leaning heavily on his cane. His hair was white as the snow that sometimes blanketed Pinehill in winter, his eyes dim but still sharp with memories no one else carried. He shuffled forward, the crowd parting for him, until he stood over the dog with a tremor in his lip. "I know him," Amos said quietly. The room stilled. "I know this dog." Jack looked up, surprised. "You've seen him before?" Amos nodded, lowering himself onto a nearby stool. "He used to belong to the Matthews family. Lived on the far edge of town. That dog was just a pup when they brought him home. Smartest shepherd I ever saw. Loyal too. He'd run after those children, guard them at the creek, sleep by their front steps every night. Folks said he had the heart of an angel. Name was Ranger." Whispers rippled through the barn, the kind that carried both recognition and unease. The Matthews family was a name spoken less these days. Tragedy had a way of erasing itself from conversations, leaving only uneasy silence. "What happened?" Mrs. Bell asked, her voice trembling. Amos sighed, eyes misting with the weight of years. "It was 3 winters ago. The Matthews boy fell through the ice at Pine Creek. Ranger was with him. They said the dog barked and barked until help came, but by the time they pulled the boy out, it was too late. After that, well, Mr. Matthews never forgave the dog. fool man blamed him for not saving the child, though Lord knows Ranger tried harder than any of us could have. They locked him up after that, and then one day he was gone. Folks assumed he'd run off. Some whispered darker things. I never saw him again, until now. The barn fell silent except for the steady crackle of the fire. Jack's hand stilled on the shepherd's fur as he absorbed the story. Betrayal, plus abandonment. The scars made sense now, not just from beatings, but from a heart broken by the ones he loved most. Clara, sitting cross-legged beside the quilts, reached out with her small hand. Her tiny fingers brushed across the dog's side, tracing the very scars that told his story. She didn't cry this time. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned close, her lips moving in a whisper too soft for anyone else to hear. It was as though she was speaking directly into the shepherd's wounded soul. The dog stirred. His ears twitched faintly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on her face. The barn held its breath as the little girl rested her forehead against his paw, whispering again. A hush fell deeper, as if even the storm outside paused to listen. Jack swallowed hard. She feels it. She knows his pain. No one doubted him. There was something unexplainable in the way the girl's silent whispers seemed to reach the shepherd where no medicine could. His breathing eased, his tail twitched faintly. A wounded creature beginning to believe, if only for a moment, that kindness still existed. Amos's gaze lingered on the broken wagon outside, its shattered wheels visible through the open barn door. Funny, isn't it? That wagon's been rotting there for years. Splintered and forgotten. And now, of all things, that's where he ends up. Broken wagon, broken trust, broken past. Yet here he is, still alive. Jack's throat tightened. The symbolism was too sharp to ignore. A wagon that once carried goods and promise, now nothing but ruin. A dog that once carried loyalty and love, now discarded and scarred. Both abandoned. Both rediscovered by the smallest, most innocent hands. Clara shifted suddenly, crawling forward on the quilts. Someone had left a shallow bowl of stew near the fire, untouched. She reached for it, her little arms struggling under its weight, and carried it back to the shepherd. The villagers watched as she placed the bowl gently before him, her small fingers dipping in first to scoop a piece of softened bread. She held it out, her hand trembling, eyes wide with hope. The dog sniffed faintly, his body resisting, too weak or too broken to care. But Clara didn't give up. She pressed the bread closer, her soft voice whispering again. Her eyes never left his. Slowly, painfully, the shepherd lifted his head. His tongue flicked against her hand, tasting, then pulling the morsel into his mouth. The barn erupted in a gasp. 4 hours he had refused water, refused comfort. And now, because of her, he had taken his first bite. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. Jack's heart leapt at the sight. His granddaughter hadn't smiled like that in weeks. It was as though the shepherd's survival and her own healing had become one and the same. The dog chewed slowly, weakly, but he ate again when Clara offered more. Only from her hand. No one else dared to move. The bond was sealed. Broken past met innocent present, and something unspoken tied them together. Jack placed a hand over his chest, feeling the weight of it all. He eats for her, he whispered. Only for her. The villagers exchanged looks, no longer divided by doubt or fear. In their eyes burned something new, responsibility, belonging, maybe even redemption. The shepherd was no longer just a stray pulled from wreckage. He was a survivor of their town's history, a mirror of their failures, and now, through the tears and whispers of a child, a chance to heal what had once been lost. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of hope and recovery. The barn, once a hollow shell of broken boards and forgotten tools, now pulsed with life. The German shepherd rested on a bed of quilts near the fire, his breathing steadier with each sunrise. His wounds, though raw and angry, began to knit under careful tending. But more than medicine or blankets, it was the presence of a child that breathed life back into him. Every morning, Clara padded into the barn in her tiny blue dress, her curls still tangled from sleep. She would tiptoe across the straw with one hand clutching her blanket and the other holding a battered toy, a wooden horse missing a wheel, or a rag doll whose seams had seen better days. She never came empty-handed. She always came to share. One morning, Jack watched from the doorway as Clara carefully draped her small blanket across the shepherd's back. It was too small to cover his whole body, but she patted it into place with such seriousness that no one dared correct her. "There," she whispered softly, her voice still fragile but stronger than before, "now you're warm." The dog's tail brushed the floor once, weak but unmistakable, and Clara giggled. It was a sound Jack had thought he might never hear again. Another day, she knelt on the floor beside him, lining up her toys in a neat little row. A chipped teacup, a cloth bunny, the wheel-less horse. She held each one up to the shepherd's face as if introducing her best friends. The dog sniffed gently at each offering, his tired eyes following her every move. At one point, Clara pressed the cloth bunny into his paws, curling his heavy legs around it like a child tucking in a doll. The shepherd didn't resist. He simply lowered his head on top of it as though honoring her gift. The villagers saw it all. They passed by the barn to bring bread, milk, or spare blankets, and each time they found the same scene. Clara and the shepherd, side by side, silent yet bound by something deeper than words. Soon, the whispers began. "Have you seen it?" Mrs. Bell asked as she handed Jack a pot of stew. That little one's laughter, bright as springtime again. All because of him. Earl Jennings, once the loudest voice for putting the dog down, stood quietly by the doorway one evening, watching as Clara lay curled against the shepherd's chest, both of them asleep. His rough hand scratched the back of his neck. "Guardian angel, that's what he is," Earl muttered. "Dogs should have died under that wagon, but instead he's guardin' her. Maybe guardin' all of us." The name stuck. Before long, people began calling him the guardian angel dog. Each day brought more visitors. Neighbors from Pinehill trickled into the barn carrying baskets of food, rolls of bandages, jars of honey, and quilts sewn with care. Old Mrs. Turner brought a jar of salve for wounds. The blacksmith offered to repair the barn door so it would keep the rain out. The town schoolteacher brought picture books, saying perhaps Clara might one day read them to her new friend. The barn filled with gifts, not just for the shepherd, but for Clara too, as though the town had decided that helping one meant helping both. It wasn't just Pinehill. News began to spread to nearby towns. A child who hadn't spoken since her mother's death, laughing again because of a dog rescued from under a wagon. Travelers passing through stopped to peer into the barn, whispering in awe as they watched the bond. Stories took on a life of their own. Some said the dog was heaven sent. Others believed he had been spared to guard the girl for reasons beyond human understanding. The story became less about tragedy and more about miracle. For Jack Harper, it was a kind of healing he hadn't dared hope for. He would sit in his rocking chair at dusk, pipe resting unlit between his fingers, watching through the open barn doors as his granddaughter skipped across the straw, her laughter spilling out like music. The shepherd, though still stiff and scarred, struggled to his feet to follow her, his eyes never leaving her small frame. If she toddled toward the chicken coop, he limped after her. If she bent down to gather daisies from the fence line, he lowered his nose to sniff them too. If she stumbled, his body braced against hers, steadying her as if he had sworn an oath to keep her from falling. One evening, Clara toddled out into the yard carrying her rag doll. The shepherd limped beside her, and the villagers paused in their work to watch. She sat on the porch step, set the doll down, and leaned against the dog's side. The German shepherd bent his head and licked her cheek, and she laughed, a laugh so pure that even the hardest faces softened. Mrs. Bell dabbed at her eyes with her apron, whispering, "That sound, we thought we'd never hear it again." Jack stood behind them all, his arms folded, his throat tight with pride. "That dog's not just healing," he said softly. "He's giving her back to us." The town believed him. Each new day proved it true. Clara's silence had been heavy, an ache that weighed on everyone who loved her. But now, piece by piece, word by word, giggle by giggle, her voice returned, and with it, the heart of the town itself. Sometimes at night, when the barn was quiet, Jack would catch Clara sitting cross-legged beside the shepherd, her lips moving in whispers only the dog seemed to understand. His ears twitched, his eyes fixed on hers, as though he truly listened. Jack never interrupted. He let the child speak her secrets into the ears of the only soul she trusted fully. And always, when she was finished, the shepherd's paw would stretch out, resting gently over her lap as if to say, "I understand. You're not alone." The storm that had nearly taken them both was now only a memory. In its place had bloomed something Pinehill had not felt in years, a story of healing, of laughter returning, of a guardian angel dog who had stitched together the torn fabric of a family and, in turn, a town. And though scars still marked his body, and though Clara's heart still carried shadows of loss, together they became something whole again, something people whispered about in wonder even beyond the borders of Pinehill. The late summer sun dipped low over Pinehill, casting long shadows across the dusty road that wound through town. For weeks, the story of the guardian angel dog had been told and retold, at market stalls, on church steps, even in nearby towns. To many, he was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of second chances, of hope reborn in the laughter of a little girl. But symbols, no matter how cherished, have a way of being challenged. And the challenge came in the form of a man with a hard jaw, a twisted sneer, and the stench of whiskey on his breath. It was a Thursday when Joseph Matthews returned. The name was enough to make whispers stir before he even stepped into the barn. Once, he had been a respected farmer on the town's edge. But tragedy soured him, and bitterness had turned him cruel. Now, with his boots heavy on the barn's wooden floor, he jabbed a finger toward the German shepherd who lay quietly beside Clara. "That's my dog," he spat. "Name's Ranger. Always been mine. You folks have no right keepin' him." Gasps filled the barn. Jack Harper stood instantly, his weathered hands curling into fists at his sides. "That animal hasn't known kindness in years, Joseph. You threw him away. If it weren't for this child, he'd be dead under that wagon." Joseph's lip curled. "Doesn't matter. Law's law. Property's property. And he's mine." Clara clutched tighter at the shepherd's fur, her wide blue eyes brimming with tears. She buried her face into his neck, shaking her head fiercely. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but audible. "He stays." The dog stirred at her words, lifting his scarred head. His amber eyes flicked between the angry man and the trembling child. With a low whine, he pressed his muzzle closer against her cheek, steadying her, as if to say he understood. The barn filled quickly that evening. Word spread like wildfire. Joseph Matthews had returned, and he wanted the guardian angel dog back. Villagers crowded into the small space, their voices rising in heated debate. "He's right," some muttered uneasily. "By law, the dog's his. Don't matter what happened before." "Law?" Mrs. Bell snapped, her face flushed with fury. "What law lets a man chain a dog till his neck bleeds and leave him to starve?" Earl Jennings stepped forward, his voice gruff but steady. "I'll admit, I was one who said we should put the dog down. But I've seen the truth now. That child's laughter, that dog's eyes, you don't tear that apart. Not for law. Not for anything. But Joseph would not be moved. "You're all blind," he barked. "He's mine. And if you don't hand him over, I'll take it up with the sheriff." At that, the barn erupted into shouts. Some begged Jack to fight. Others urged compromise. The storm of voices rattled the beams, but in the midst of it, Clara did something no one expected. She stood. Her little frame trembled as she rose from the quilts, her small hands wrapped tightly around the shepherd's paw. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her chin lifted with surprising strength. "He's not yours," she said softly. Her voice wavered, but the barn quieted. "He's mine." The shepherd, as if hearing her claim, stirred again. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself onto his forelegs. His body still bore the marks of suffering, his gait unsteady, but determination burned in his eyes. Limping forward, he settled directly in front of Clara and lowered himself back down, resting his paw firmly on her lap. The silence that followed was absolute. A declaration had been made, not in words, but in the ancient, unbreakable language of loyalty. Joseph scoffed, though his bravado faltered. "That proves nothing. He's confused, that's all." But the crowd had seen. More importantly, they had felt. The gesture was not confusion. It was allegiance. The guardian angel dog had chosen, and he had chosen a child who had once lived in silence but now spoke and laughed because of him. "This isn't just about a dog." Amos Turner's old voice broke the silence. He leaned on his cane, eyes glistening. "It's about who we are as a town. Are we people who value law written on paper? Or are we people who honor what's right written in the heart? That dog don't belong to Joseph anymore. He belongs to her." The murmurs swelled into agreement. A decision had to be made, not in the barn, but in town hall, where matters of weight were judged. So that night, Pinehill gathered in the wooden hall at the center of town. Lanterns burned bright against the dark, rows of benches filled with neighbors who had come to witness history. Clara sat on Jack's lap, clutching her shepherd's paw, while Joseph stood stiff at the front, his eyes flashing with anger. The debate began anew. Joseph argued law and property, waving old papers and pointing fingers. Jack spoke of compassion, of what the town had seen with their own eyes. Neighbors rose to share what they had witnessed. Clara's laughter returning, the dog refusing food from any hand but hers, the healing power of their bond. One by one, voices added to the tide. By the end, it was no longer a debate, but a question of conscience. The mayor, a stern man unused to sentiment, finally stood. "This matter comes down to us all," he declared. "Let it be settled by vote. Raise your hand if you believe the shepherd should return to Mr. Matthews." Only 2 hands rose. "Now raise your hand if you believe he belongs with Clara and her grandfather." Dozens of hands lifted high, steady and unwavering. The decision was overwhelming. Joseph's face darkened. "This isn't the end. You'll regret this." He shoved past the benches, his boots slamming against the floorboards as he stormed into the night. But no one followed him. Their eyes were fixed instead on the little girl in the front row, who now hugged her shepherd tightly, her tears drying against his fur. The townspeople cheered, some clapping, some wiping their eyes. The guardian angel dog had not only survived a wagon's wreckage, he had survived the weight of cruelty, the chains of abandonment, and now the claim of an unworthy master. And in front of the entire town, he had declared where his loyalty truly lay. Not with the past, not with the man who broke him, but with the child who healed him. Sometimes the faintest cries are heard only by the smallest hearts. In the middle of a storm, when grown men dismissed the sound as wind and wagon wheels, it was the soft ears of a child that listened. It was the innocence of a little girl in a blue dress that carried the courage to step forward when no one else did. And in doing so, she saved not just a broken shepherd, but an entire community that had forgotten what compassion truly meant. The German Shepherd, once discarded and scarred, became more than a dog to Pinehill. He became a mirror, showing them their own fractured past and their ability to heal again. He became a symbol of loyalty that refuses to die, survival that endures even under weight too heavy to bear, and second chances that arrive when least expected. People began to say that his paw prints were written not just on the barn floor, but on the very soul of the town. And for Clara, he was more than a companion. He was her guardian, her laughter restored, her silence broken. Where once she had walked alone in shadows of loss, now she ran with a friend who would never leave her side. Together, child and shepherd rewove the torn fabric of a town, stitching it together with threads of loyalty and innocence. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that loyalty never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from, because some stories are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to be carried.